At some point, millions of us who are into genealogy have probably wondered who actually owns Ancestry.com. I mean, they've sold 27 million DNA kits and have over 3 million paid subscribers. That's a lot of customers. The real story involves Wall Street and billions of dollars. But there's also an ownership myth that won't go away. Let's clear up the biggest rumour first. For what feels like forever, people assume that Ancestry is owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But is that actually true? Well, the short answer is no, not at all. It's a total misconception. So if it's not the LDS Church, then who exactly is holding the keys to this massive treasure trove of family history data? The current majority owner is the Blackstone Group. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because they are a massive player on Wall Street. This isn't some non-profit or religious group. We're talking about one of the biggest private equity firms in the world, a company that manages everything from real estate to huge media outlets. They have over 1 trillion, that T is for trillion, of assets under their management. It's a very different world from dusty old archives and family trees, that's for sure. And they didn't get Ancestry cheap. Back in August of 2020, Blackstone paid $4.7 billion for their stake. And let's do a few comparisons. What else goes for $4 billion? Wells Fargo sold their railway assets for $4.4 billion in 2025. That was about 105,000 rail cars. Just Eat, the global takeaway delivery service, was bought for $4.2 billion, and Ancestry was valued at a little more 5 years ago. Okay, so we've established the who. It's Blackstone. And I will get into why Blackstone, which traditionally had a massive focus on real estate, bought Ancestry. But before I do that, I want to go back in time to where Ancestry came from. I mean, given that it holds our family trees and for many of us our DNA, it's natural to be interested in the company origins. It might surprise you to learn that Ancestry didn't start as a website. It was founded way back in 1983 as a company that published genealogy books. There were 3 founders, John Sittner, Robert Shaw, and W. Rex Sittner, and they were based in Utah. By the way, despite the location, at least one of them, John Sittner, wasn't a member of the LDS Church. His granddaughter confirmed that to me in a comment on my website. And the original small company was headquartered in his house in Salt Lake City. The company was publishing collections of genealogy records like death records and marriage records, and John negotiated with his internet provider to get this data online. In 1995, this little company registered the domain name Ancestry.com. I took a trip on the Wayback Machine to get the earliest version of Ancestry.com I could find. Earliest year is 1996. Here's the homepage. Not too clunky. People could have voted for it for their favorite genealogy website. And a year later, in 1997, we get the first takeover. So now let's change tack to address a different company. And this company certainly was founded by members of the LDS Church. This company's name was Infobases. And you've got to admit that the Ancestry website of the day was a little bit more snazzy. The origins of Infobases is in Brigham Young University, which is a university owned by the LDS Church. In 1988, the university president made a speech imploring his students to sort, sift, prioritize, integrate, and give some sense of wholeness, some spirit of connectiveness to great eternal truths. He talked about using technology to make sense of information. This lit a fire under a student there named Paul B. Allen. Not to be mistaken, by the way, for the Paul Allen that co-founded Microsoft. Totally different guy. So this Paul Allen and another BYU grad named Dan Taggart, they started a company called Infobases in 1990. Their goal was to digitize church documents. But then they get into selling genealogy data on floppy disks. The younger generation may not be sure what that is. We slid them into our rather large computers and used them to store and read data. So Infobases takes off and becomes a successful and fast-growing company. So now for the first buyout of Ancestry. In 1997, Infobases buys their competitor. They get the company name, and more importantly, they get the Ancestry.com domain. And Ancestry.com became the brand. Yeah, it was always going to be more memorable than Infobases. It's interesting to look at the Ancestry.com homepage at the end of the year of that buyout. Clearly, money's been put into it. You can see the impact of the investment. Let's stick on the trail of buyouts, and now it's Ancestry doing the buying. I've got a timeline on my website, Ancestry was incredibly ambitious. They wanted to become the undisputed home for all historical data on the planet. And their strategy for this in the 2000s wasn't subtle. It was brutally simple. Corner the market, buy up every major data source and competitor that they could get their hands on. They bought RootsWeb, a huge online community. They bought genealogy.com, one of their biggest rivals. Another purchase was Fold3, a massive military archive, and then later they bought Find a Grave, the place for cemetery records. And as they bought them, they rolled their data and their users into its massive, ever-growing empire. So what does all that buying get you? Well, by 2018, they'd piled up 10 billion historical records. Birth certificates, military files, census data. That's a digital library of human history on a massive scale. Just 4 years later, in 2022, that number had tripled to 30 billion records. That's not just steady growth, that's a flat out data explosion. But here's the thing, digitizing paper records was only a part of the story. The real game changer that turned Ancestry into a household name was something different. And this started in 2012. It was the pivot point for the entire company. That's the year Ancestry launched its autosomal DNA test. Before this, consumer DNA tests were pretty limited, but this new test was much more comprehensive. All of a sudden, people could match with second, third, even fourth cousins on any branch of a family tree. The DNA product also offered an ethnicity estimate, but that technology is still being worked upon. Were fascinating to people and were discussed at parties. People put their results on social media. All great marketing for Ancestry. By 2018, having 3 million paying subscribers for their genealogy services was pretty impressive. But they had sold 18 million DNA kits. The DNA offering became the true engine of the company, growing its network to over 25 million people by 2023. It totally transformed the business and an industry. So let's get back to the buyouts. And as there's quite a large cast involved, I'll jump to my own article on this, which I wrote back in 2020. And I'll jump down to this section. So, 2007, Spectrum Equity took 30% ownership. Then in 2009, Ancestry went public. The IPO was $100 million. A small change, right? Because in 2012, they went private again with a buyout led by Primera for 1.6 billion. Yeah, 1.6 billion. Quite a jump. Little footnote for me, I'd forgotten I wrote this. 2016, two private equity funds get involved, Silver Lake and GIC. We'll come back to GIC later. And then finally, 2020 was when Blackstone swooped in. Remember that number? $4.7 billion. So the ownership history is pretty black and white, yeah? It's a corporation owned by a huge investment firm. So why do so many people still think it's owned by the Mormon Church after all this time? This right here, this chart is the reasons for the confusion. People are constantly mixing up Ancestry with Family Search. Family Search is owned by the LDS Church. It's a non-profit. But look at the overlap. Both are headquartered in Utah, and they're often business partners. You've got the guy who really grew the company, Paul Allen, was an active LDS member. A lot of the staff in Ancestry's Utah base come from Brigham Young University, owned by the LDS. The two companies have worked together on projects for years. There's so much overlap that it's been very easy for the misconception to form and just stay. Okay, there's one more myth we should probably squash while we're at it. You might see this pop up online sometimes. The idea that Ancestry is owned by China. Also a big no. This one seems to come from a mix-up over a former investor, a company called GIC. I did say earlier that I'd come back to them, right? GIC stands for the Government of Singapore Investment Corporation. Not China, Singapore. And anyway, they were never a majority shareholder. So there you have it. That's a run-through material from two articles on my website. I'll drop the links in the description below.